Hello, how are you doing today? There is a very specific type of silence in an unfinished basement in Ohio. It's heavy, damp, and it forces you to listen to your own thoughts. I'm 58 years old, and as I sit here on this folding chair, my entire net worth sits at exactly $140. Just a few months ago, I was signing a 12-month lease on a beautiful apartment in Ipanema. Last week, I was sleeping on a cold steel bench at Terminal 2 of Galeão International Airport in Rio de Janeiro, waiting to spot anyone holding a blue passport so I could swallow whatever pride I had left and beg complete strangers for a flight home. I didn't lose my money in a sudden market crash. I wasn't held up at gunpoint in some dark alleyway. Honestly, if that had been the case, I might still have a shred of dignity left to hold on to. No. The truth is, much worse. I handed over everything I had, my life savings, my credit, my future, willingly. I practically forced it into her hands. The bitter irony is that I spent my entire life being the rational one. 30 years as a supply chain logistics manager. My whole career was built on calculating risks, auditing processes, and spotting inconsistencies from a mile away. I was paid to see the traps other people missed. I thought I was too smart, too analytical to ever be taken advantage of. But I learned the hard way that when you are quietly suffocating from your own irrelevance, when you are desperate just to feel needed again, you don't just ignore the red flags. You paint them green. You look at a catastrophic risk, and you convince yourself you're making a calculated investment. I am not telling you this because I want your pity. I don't deserve it. And I know that. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand exactly how this happens. Because the most terrifying part of losing everything isn't the betrayal itself. It's the fact that right up until the second the floor collapsed beneath me, every single mistake I made felt like a brilliant, perfectly logical decision. My name is Arthur Pendelton. For 30 years, my entire world was governed by spreadsheets, risk assessments, and efficiency metrics. I ran supply chain logistics for a mid-sized manufacturing firm back in Columbus, Ohio. If a shipment of raw materials was delayed by 3 hours in Shanghai, I knew exactly how it would impact our bottom line in the Midwest. My brain is hardwired to look for leaks in a system. I don't believe in luck, and I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in data. I was the guy people came to when things broke down, because I never made decisions based on emotion. That pragmatic nature is exactly how I survived my divorce. 25 years of marriage ended not with a screaming match, but with a quiet, devastating division of assets. I did the math, sold our suburban home, cleared out our shared debts, and walked away with exactly $85,000 in liquid savings. That, combined with a modest pension of $1,200 a month, was my entire safety net. It wasn't wealth, but it was exact. I knew where every single cent was allocated, but a spreadsheet can't tell you what to do with an empty Tuesday afternoon. It certainly didn't prepare me for the phrase corporate restructuring. At 58, the company I had given my life to handed me an early retirement package and politely escorted me out the door. Suddenly, the emails stopped. The phone went dead. My 2 adult children were busy living their own lives in different states, calling maybe once a month out of a sense of obligation. I went from managing multi-million-dollar international operations to managing nothing but the thermostat in a silent apartment. I felt completely invisible, like a machine that had been unplugged, covered with a tarp, and pushed into the back corner of a dark garage. Nobody needed me to fix anything. Nobody relied on me. I realized with absolute terror that I could disappear for weeks and no one would even notice. I had to get out. I needed to prove to myself that my best years weren't already buried in the past. So, I approached my life the exact same way I approached a logistics crisis. I researched. I spent months studying global economies, watching videos about expats, and calculating exchange rates. The logic was bulletproof. By leveraging the strength of the US dollar against the Brazilian real, my $85,000 wouldn't just be survival money, it would buy me time, comfort, and a complete reinvention. I didn't move to Rio de Janeiro to be reckless. I was incredibly cautious. I rented a modest, highly secure Airbnb in Copacabana, completely avoiding the flashy tourist traps. I put myself on a strict budget of $1,500 a month. I planned to take Portuguese classes, buy my groceries at the local market, and slowly integrate into the culture. I figured eventually I might look for a partner to share my life with, but I was in no rush. I knew all the stereotypes. I had read all the warnings about older American men going to Latin America and getting taken to the cleaners by younger women. I swore to myself I would never be that cliché. I had my guard up so high nothing was getting through. But the problem with building a fortress against the obvious threats is that you stop looking for the subtle ones. You don't realize that the most dangerous things don't break down your door. They wait for you to open it yourself, simply because you're tired of being alone on the inside. I arrived in Rio de Janeiro on a humid Tuesday morning. I didn't choose Brazil because of some romanticized fantasy or a sudden, reckless midlife crisis. I chose it because the math made sense. After the restructuring at the firm forced me out, I spent my last few months in Ohio sitting in my silent living room, watching countless hours of YouTube videos about expats living comfortably in Latin America. The algorithm fed me exactly what I wanted to see. Men my age, looking relaxed and respected, talking about how the exchange rate had essentially tripled their purchasing power overnight. It was a logical solution to an emotional problem. By leveraging the strength of the US dollar against the Brazilian real, my $85,000 wouldn't just be a dwindling survival fund. It would buy me time, comfort, and a complete reinvention. I treated the relocation like a corporate logistics project. I bypassed the luxury oceanfront penthouses and rented a modest, highly secure Airbnb a few blocks inland in Copacabana. It had a heavy iron gate and a stern 24-hour doorman. I set a rigid operating budget for myself, exactly $1,500 a month. Back in Columbus, that barely covered basic living expenses. Down there, it was enough to eat well, pay the bills, and never have to worry about looking at the price of a cup of coffee. My plan was structured and, I believed, entirely foolproof. I would spend my mornings walking the black and white mosaic promenade, my afternoons taking intensive Portuguese classes, and my evenings reading on my small balcony. I wasn't looking for the stereotypical tourist nightlife. I just wanted to exist somewhere where the air didn't feel so stagnant. I told myself that if I eventually met someone to share my time with, it would happen organically, strictly on my own terms. I was going to be the smart, cautious expat, the one who integrated slowly, respected the culture, and never let his guard down. For the first few weeks, the spreadsheet logic worked perfectly. I figured out the layout of the local grocery store. I learned enough of the language to order my meals and exchange polite, brief nods with the doorman. On paper, it was exactly the safe, calculated fresh start I had designed. But there is a crucial detail about living alone in a foreign country that those expat videos never mention. When you don't speak the language fluently, every single interaction is purely transactional. You buy your bread, you say thank you, you leave. You point at a menu, you pay, you walk away. Days start to bleed together without a single meaningful conversation. I would sit on the beach, surrounded by thousands of people laughing, playing futevole, sharing cold beers in the sand, and I had never felt more entirely isolated in my life. The suffocating silence I had tried to escape in Ohio had followed me, only now it was amplified by the vibrant, deafening noise of a city that didn't know or care that I existed. I had my money sitting safely in a high-yield account, a meticulous daily schedule, and a perfectly secure apartment. But when the sun went down and the streetlights flickered on, I had absolutely no one to tell about my day. Nobody needed my advice. Nobody relied on me to fix anything. I didn't realize it then, but my deeply rational, meticulously constructed plan had done exactly one thing. It had perfectly insulated me from the obvious dangers of the outside world, while leaving me quietly desperate for anyone willing to reach in and pull me out. It was during my third week that the isolation finally started to crack. I had found a quiet, family-owned padaria, a local bakery, a few blocks away from the main avenues of Copacabana. It smelled of strong roasted coffee and warm cheese bread, and more importantly, it wasn't catering to tourists. I went there every afternoon just to sit and be around the ambient noise of other people's lives. That's where I met Camilla. She wasn't sitting at the bar waiting for a foreigner to buy her a drink. She was rushing in from the street, carrying a plastic grocery bag that suddenly tore open, spilling oranges and a carton of milk across the tiled floor. I stood up on instinct and helped her gather her things. When she looked up to thank me, she looked entirely exhausted. She was 28, dressed in a set of faded blue medical scrubs, her dark hair pulled back into a messy, practical knot. She spoke broken, hesitant English, apologizing profusely. I told her it was no trouble, but she insisted, absolutely insisted, on buying my coffee to say thank you. I tried to decline, but she was adamant. We sat at a small aluminum table for 20 minutes. She told me she worked as a receptionist at a local dental clinic, that she had just finished a 10-hour shift, and that she was a single mother rushing home to her daughter. She didn't ask what I did for a living. She didn't ask where I was staying or how much money I made. In fact, she seemed slightly intimidated by me, glancing down at her hands when she spoke. It was intoxicating. For the first time in months, I wasn't just a retired guy taking up space. I was the capable, steady gentleman who had helped a tired mother pick up her groceries. She completely shattered every stereotype of the opportunistic local I had warned myself about. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was just a hard-working woman surviving on her own. We started meeting for afternoon coffees at that same padaria. I looked forward to those hours more than I cared to admit. Whenever the bill came, she would stubbornly pull out crumpled reais from her purse to pay for her own snacks. I would try to cover it, but she'd place her hand gently over mine and shake her head. "No, Arthur, I work too," she'd say with a tired, proud smile. A few weeks in, she invited me to a Sunday barbecue at her aunt's house in the North Zone, the Zona Norte. It was a working-class neighborhood far away from the postcard views of the beaches. Sitting there on a plastic chair, surrounded by her loud, welcoming family, eating grilled meat and listening to a language I barely understood, I felt a profound sense of arrival. I wasn't an expat anymore. I was an insider. I belonged. Our conversations grew deeper. She started asking me for advice. She would bring up small personal debts, a late electricity bill, a complicated payment plan for her scooter, and ask me how she should handle them. When I mapped out a simple budget for her on a napkin, her eyes widened. She told me I was brilliant. She would sit quietly and listen intently as I talked about my old life, about supply chains and logistics, and managing complex operations, things my own children used to roll their eyes at. Camilla didn't roll her eyes. She looked at me with a genuine, absolute respect that I hadn't felt in a decade. I firmly believed she was drawn to my maturity, my stability, the fact that I was a grounded, reliable man in a world that had clearly been chaotic for her. There were moments, of course, that should have made me pause. Small things. One afternoon, she arrived at the bakery with red, swollen eyes. When I gently pressed her, she broke down and mentioned a sudden, urgent medical bill for her mother's treatment. But before I could even open my mouth, she held up her hands and stepped back. "Please," she said, her voice shaking, "do not offer me money. I am not asking for that. I just needed to vent to someone I trust." To a rational observer, that might look like a perfectly executed hook. But to a lonely, aging man desperate to prove his worth, it looked exactly like vulnerability. I didn't see a red flag. I saw a proud woman trying to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, and I saw a problem that I could effortlessly fix. I didn't hand her the money because she asked for it. I practically forced it on her, entirely convinced I was just being a traditional gentleman. Once you cross that line, once you establish that your money can instantly dissolve her stress, the dynamic shifts. But it doesn't shift loudly. It happens in increments so small, so seemingly logical, that you don't even realize you are rewriting the rules of the relationship. A few weeks after I paid her mother's medical debt, Camilla's schedule at the clinic suddenly became chaotic. She would text me, exhausted, saying her boss was forcing her to work unexpected overtime. The quiet, inexpensive afternoons at the bakery were quickly replaced by rushed, late-night dinners. She could only manage to see me if I met her halfway, usually at these high-end, dimly lit restaurants closer to my neighborhood. Naturally, when the check arrived, I paid. To me, it wasn't an imposition, it was simple logistics. I had the financial means. Dropping $100 on a nice dinner or clearing a $500 late fee on her utility bill meant absolutely nothing to my bottom line, but it radically changed her day-to-day life. I told myself I was completely in control of my budget. I wasn't being used. I was allocating resources to improve the quality of life for a woman I was falling deeply in love with. By month 3, my entire world had shrunk down to the space she occupied. I quietly stopped attending my Portuguese classes. I didn't see the point anymore. Camilla had become my translator, my guide, my lens through which I experienced the city. It felt like a partnership, but in reality, I was voluntarily blindfolding myself. That was when the logistics of my life started moving entirely through her hands. I decided my cramped Airbnb wasn't suitable anymore. I wanted a real home, a place where she and her daughter could stay on the weekends, maybe even move into eventually. When I started looking at long-term rentals in Ipanema, Camilla immediately intervened. She warned me about the gringo tax, the invisible, exorbitant markup landlords slapped on foreigners who didn't know the system. It made perfect sense. I had spent 30 years negotiating supply contracts. I knew what a geographical markup looked like. "Let my friends help," she told me, her voice low and protective. "They know the owners. We can get the local price." The catch, she explained, was that these deals operated outside the formal banking system to avoid heavy government taxes. To secure the apartment and buy the necessary furniture, the transactions had to be done strictly in cash, handed directly to her so she could act as the intermediary. If a vendor in Ohio had proposed that, I would have flagged the account for fraud and fired the contractor on the spot. But here, in Rio, I rationalized it as cultural fluency. Brazil was a cash-based, informal economy. Everyone knew that. I convinced myself that by letting her handle the thousands of dollars in cash I withdrew from the ATMs week after week, she was actually protecting me. I was beating the system. I signed a 12-month lease on a beautiful, sun-drenched apartment in Ipanema, completely reliant on her word that the numbers added up. I even bought her a brand new scooter for $3,000 in cash. I didn't frame it as a gift. I framed it as a safety measure. I couldn't stand the thought of her riding the crowded, dangerous public buses late at night after her shifts. It was a practical solution to an operational problem. I was so insulated inside this bubble of my own making that I actively pushed away anyone trying to pop it. Camilla introduced me to an immigration lawyer, an associate of hers, to start the process for my permanent visa. He advised me to stop talking to other American expats, claiming that associating with the wrong type of foreigners could trigger unnecessary audits from the federal police. It sounded official. It sounded like the kind of insider advice you only get when you have local connections. So, I cut off the few casual acquaintances I had made. My children back in Ohio noticed the shift. During one of our rare phone calls, my daughter gently questioned my spending habits after seeing some international wire transfer fees on a shared banking dashboard I had forgotten to revoke her access to. I didn't explain. I didn't reassure her. I became fiercely, embarrassingly defensive. I told her I was a grown man, a former executive, and I didn't need a lecture on financial management from someone who still struggled to balance a checkbook. I changed my passwords the next morning and stopped taking her calls. Looking back, the signs weren't just red flags, they were blaring sirens. the erratic work hours that could never be verified, the sudden emergencies that always required liquid cash, the systematic way I was separated from my language classes, from the expat community, from my own family. But when you are 58 years old, terrified of dying alone and irrelevant, you don't want to see a predator. You want to see a partner. Every time my analytical brain noticed an inconsistency, my ego immediately rushed in to build a bridge over it. I wasn't a victim, I was a provider. I wasn't being isolated, I was being protected. I was the smartest guy in the room, orchestrating a beautiful new life, completely oblivious to the fact that I was just a mark, walking willingly into the slaughterhouse. By the 6th month, the illusion was so perfectly constructed that I couldn't distinguish the scaffolding from the building. We were living together in Ipanema, I was paying for everything, and I had successfully convinced myself that this was simply the cost of doing business in a new life. That was when she brought up the boutique. It didn't feel like a sudden pitch. It felt like the natural, inevitable next step in our partnership. Camilla had been complaining for weeks about how the clinic was draining her soul, how she wanted to build something real for her daughter's future. One evening, sitting on our balcony overlooking the ocean, she laid out a business plan for a high-end women's clothing store in a busy commercial gallery in Copacabana. She didn't just ask for money, she presented it as a joint venture. More importantly, she presented it as the definitive solution to my visa situation. If we register the business, she explained, her voice steady and serious, you qualify for a permanent investor visa. No more tourist renewals, no more immigration lawyers. You become a legal resident, and we build a passive income for our family. My logistics brain immediately seized on the logic. An investor visa, a physical, revenue-generating asset. It wasn't a handout. It was a strategic deployment of capital. I had $50,000 left in my high-yield account in the States. Earning a measly 4% interest in Ohio was nothing compared to establishing a footprint in a major international market. There was, of course, one logistical hurdle. Camilla explained with genuine frustration that Brazilian bureaucracy prohibited a foreigner on a tourist visa from being the primary owner of this specific type of commercial enterprise. The primary operating account had to be in the name of a Brazilian citizen until my permanent visa was approved. If you are reading this and screaming at me, I understand. But you have to remember the ecosystem I was living in. She had already saved me thousands of dollars negotiating our apartment in cash. She had shown me how the informal economy worked. In my mind, navigating these legal gray areas was just part of the local fluency I prided myself on possessing. I wasn't being reckless. I was executing a calculated workaround. The next morning, I authorized an international wire transfer of $50,000 directly into a corporate banking account solely in Camilla's name. I didn't flinch. I felt like a patriarch. I felt powerful. I was no longer a discarded, obsolete middle manager. I was an international investor securing a future for the woman I loved, and for a brief, beautiful moment, the universe entirely validated my decision. A week after the wire cleared, Camilla took me to the commercial gallery. It was a prime location, heavy foot traffic, nestled between a jewelry store and a popular cafe. The space was empty, stripped down to the concrete, but it was real. She introduced me to a young man with a clipboard, the architect, who respectfully shook my hand and spent an hour measuring the walls and discussing lighting fixtures with us. Later that week, she came home beaming, dropping a heavy folder onto the dining table. Inside were official government tax documents, the CNPJ, the Brazilian corporate registry. And there, printed clearly on the second page under a section labeled Silent Partners, was my full legal name. I looked at that piece of paper, and every lingering microscopic doubt I had evaporated. I had done it. I had beaten the system. To celebrate, Camilla booked us a romantic weekend getaway to a beautiful coastal town called Buzios. She rented a cliffside villa with a private infinity pool. When I reached for my wallet at the reception desk, she gently pushed my hand down. I pay for this, she smiled, her eyes shining with pride. With my savings. Because you believed in me, Arthur. Sitting on that balcony in Buzios, holding a glass of wine, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of victory. I had successfully orchestrated the perfect second act of my life. I was respected, I was loved, and I was entirely secure. I didn't know it yet, but the architect was just a friend of her cousin. The CNPJ document was a meticulously forged PDF she had printed at a local cybercafe. And that beautiful, luxurious weekend in Buzios? She paid for it using the exact same $50,000 I had wired her 3 days earlier. I was celebrating on the very edge of the cliff, completely unaware that she had already pushed me. The collapse didn't happen with a dramatic confrontation or a screaming argument. It happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. It had been 2 months since I wired the $50,000. The opening of the boutique kept getting delayed by what Camilla called municipal zoning permits. I wasn't worried. I had the forged tax document sitting in my desk drawer. I had the memory of that weekend in Buzios. I felt secure. That morning, she kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her purse, and told me she was heading to the clinic for an early shift, then straight to the commercial gallery to meet the contractors. I made my coffee, sat on the balcony of our expensive Ipanema apartment, and watched the waves. Around noon, I sent her a message asking if she wanted to get lunch. It didn't deliver. A single gray checkmark. By 4 p.m., her phone was going straight to a Portuguese automated voicemail. By 8 p.m., I was pacing the living room. I told myself she lost her phone. I told myself there was an emergency with her daughter. My brain, hardwired to find logical solutions, built a dozen different scenarios to explain her absence. None of them included the truth. The next morning, I took a taxi to the commercial gallery in Copacabana. I walked down the crowded corridor, past the jewelry store and the cafe, stopping exactly where our boutique was supposed to be. The space wasn't empty anymore. It was open. But it wasn't a clothing store. It was a brightly lit, fully stocked cell phone repair shop. I walked inside and, in my broken Portuguese, asked the teenager behind the counter how long they had been there. He looked at me, confused, and said they had signed a 5-year lease 3 months ago. They had never stopped operating. My chest tightened, but the denial was still holding on. I needed to see her. I walked 20 blocks in the sweltering heat to the dental clinic where she supposedly worked. I walked up to the front desk, my shirt soaked in sweat, and asked to speak to Camilla. I described her. The receptionist, a woman around my age, frowned and checked the system. She looked back up at me with a mix of pity and annoyance. "Nobody named Camilla has ever worked here, senor," she said. "I don't remember the walk to the local bank branch. I just remember sitting in a plastic chair across from a manager, sliding my passport across the desk, and asking him to check the joint account we had opened for household expenses. He turned his monitor toward me. The balance wasn't just 0, it was negative. She had maxed out a local credit card linked to the account, one that I had co-signed as the guarantor. In the span of 48 hours, the beautiful, meticulously planned second act of my life entirely disintegrated. My $85,000 was gone. Every cent of it. I had exactly $140 sitting in my American checking account. Because the lease on the Ipanema apartment was strictly in my name, a lease I could no longer pay, I was legally responsible for the broken contract. 3 days later, the landlord changed the locks. With nowhere to go, no money for a hotel, and too much shame to call my children in Ohio to beg for a rescue, I took a city bus to Galeão International Airport. I found a cold steel bench in Terminal 2, near the international departures. I sat there for 3 days. I survived on a bag of stale crackers and water from the bathroom sink. Every time I saw someone holding a blue American passport, I stood up, swallowed whatever dignity I had left, and asked total strangers if they could spare $20 to help me get to the U.S. consulate. I didn't lose my money because Brazil is dangerous. I didn't lose it because I was uneducated. I lost it because I was desperately, suffocatingly lonely, and I let my ego convince me that I could buy my way out of feeling irrelevant. Now, I live in this unfinished basement in my younger brother's house in Ohio. I am 58 years old, and I am starting completely over, with nothing but a folding chair and a quiet, terrible clarity. When you spend your whole life believing you are the smartest person in the room, you stop checking the locks on your own doors. You think you're making logical investments, when in reality, you're just paying someone to tell you the lie you desperately need to hear. And the most dangerous part is that the lie feels exactly like love, right up until the moment it leaves you with absolutely nothing.